Phil here. Before we get started, just a reminder that The Wind is made possible by listeners like you. If you'd like to help support the show, head to patreon.com/thewind and set up a monthly donation. There is also merchandise available at thewind.org. Today, we have an episode from Wind contributor Emily Pratt.
The Wind. With Fil Corbitt.
It must have come from the between place. The place between waking and sleep. The first knock I heard in a dream, and the second was an echo that I could hear when I was awake. But every time I heard this sound, I woke up to a street that was empty, leaves dancing in the wind, a stoplight turning from red to green to yellow to red again, signaling to no one. I drove around the country in this van and slept in it in many places, wherever I was in the country, and I heard the sound of the two knocks. And every time I heard this sound, there was never anyone there, except for once. That morning, I woke up and started driving, and as I drove, I had these premonitions of my own death at someone else's hands. It didn't feel like a thought that was my own. That same day, I discovered the music of Connie Converse. Connie Converse was a singer who wrote and recorded her own songs in the 1950s. Her music has a naive, sort of innocent, childlike quality to it that's very beautiful, but there wasn't really a market or an understanding of her type of music in the 1950s, so she didn't really have an audience. One day, she just packed up her car and left, and was never seen again. So I was driving around, listening to Connie Converse, and imagining my own death, when I came across an Italian restaurant that I used to go to with my grandma as a kid. I went there and I got dinner, and I realized as I was eating it that this felt like my last meal. Again, it felt like a thought that wasn't my own, but it was sent to me, and I didn't know what it meant. I kept driving into the Sierra Nevada mountains to look for a place to park for the night as the sun was setting. I came across Lake Tahoe. When I'm choosing a place to park at night, it has to abide by what I call the creep-cop ratio. I don't want it to be a place with a lot of foot traffic where a creep is gonna come across my van and see that I'm in there. But I also don't want it to be the kind of place that somebody would call the cops if they saw me there, or the cops would find me on their patrol and tell me to leave. The first place I found was more the latter category. It was a library, and there was a lot of other cars parked there, but as soon as I rolled in, a cop pulled in behind me, so I rolled right back out again. The second place, I came across a sushi restaurant, and the parking lot seemed good enough, but I saw a man not wearing a shirt walking around drinking out of a huge bottle of malt liquor. And then I pulled around the corner as I was leaving, and I thought, oh, that's a cool bear statue. And then the bear statue started walking. So I thought, this isn't it either. The third place that I went was a road off in the woods. And I thought, I don't see any signs saying I can't park here, so parked there to sleep. heard the 2 knocks again. And this time, there was someone there. It was just a shadow of a face, and it was swaying gently like a tree in the wind. And I thought, this is it. This is how I die. This is what it all meant. Connie Converse, the last meal, the constant ruminating about my own death. And I also thought, this isn't a dream. I'm sure of that. Face kept glancing in, and I had to dig around in the car for my keys, which was very messy. And I came across a screwdriver that I thought I might be able to use as a weapon. And I clung to it, and the face kept looking in. I thought it might sense any movement I made, so I moved very slowly. I got this feeling that it was looking at me with a mocking glance, like it was enjoying watching me struggle. I held onto the screwdriver and eventually found the keys, and by the time I found the keys, the face wasn't there anymore. So I got in the driver's seat. But before I put the keys in the ignition, I got an image in my head that if I pulled the covers out, it would be standing there in front of my headlights. So I waited, clutching the screwdriver all night until the sky turned to a light shade of blue, and eventually light shone through my windows. I pulled the window covers off and drove away. It still haunts me today that although it must have left at some point, I never heard a footstep. Hi, my name is Emily Pratt. If you've been listening to The Wind for a while, you've probably heard my voice before. I'm on the podcast today to talk about the last year of my life. I mean, the previous year of my life. I did the longest and most extensive touring I'd ever done in my life thus far with my music that I call Howls Road. Coming back from a tour always leaves me with this sort of empty feeling. It's sort of a void that I reform my sense of self within. That story I started the podcast off with, and other stories, were a way for me to talk about my experiences traveling to the audiences that I was performing to on stage. So I would tell that story and other stories, and I noticed that people chuckle at some of the parts. And so I started leaving gaps for them to laugh. And it was sort of like I was developing the rhythm and the cadence of a stand-up comedian. But what ended up happening was, as I left these gaps and this space for people to laugh, I found that people weren't always laughing, and sometimes I would leave that space and it would just be silent. And for me, that was even better, because if I were a stand-up comedian, that would mean that I bombed. But since I'm not a stand-up comedian, it's a space where people can just react and let whatever I've said settle in. So this period of emptiness after the tour sort of felt like that, like a gap where the feeling of what's just happened can be processed and felt. And this podcast is my way to report on the feelings and the thoughts that I've had since the tour ended. And even though I embrace that meaningful silence, secretly, I hope that it's funny. There's this feeling I get when I'm traveling. I call it the itch. And the itch is like a feeling that it's time to move on, and that wherever I am right now has run its course, and I need to see what the next place is going to be for me. So I usually follow that impulse to just leave, even if it's a really inconvenient or even dangerous time. There's one particular time I was in Portland, Maine, and I got the itch and I decided to leave. And this took me into the path of Hurricane Henri. Later on in that same trip, the itch led me into the path of Hurricane Ida. 2 hurricanes, and I made it out unscathed. And with a new banjo that I named Moon. It's the banjo I still play on stage today. This itch has a mysterious quality of bringing me into the realm of danger, but leaving me with a gift of some sort or another. It's sort of like a portal opened up, and I understand that if I don't step through this portal right now, it's going to close. I was in Reno visiting my friend, and on her porch, you can see from mountain range to mountain range, and the valley that sits in between was painted with the red and gold and orange colors of fall. As I looked to my left, I noticed just past the mountains to the east, these rising tendrils of sand were reaching for the sunlight. I gauged it to be about 50 miles away, and I could see these giant spirals rising from the mountains. And I realized that's the direction I have to drive. The moment that I stepped into my car, raindrops started to hit my windshield. So I started to drive east, and I ran into what's called the washoe zephyr. The washoe zephyr is a violent and powerful wind. Friend of the show, Mike Branch, referred to it as a continuing conversation between mountain and desert. It's sort of like you're standing between an argument between giants, like the mountain and the desert. and the breath that comes from the mountain shakes everything around you. You could see street signs bending. Cars were swerving. I swerved a couple times. The road was slick with rain, and the sand cut off all visibility. I was driving through a sandstorm on a wet road, with the wind tearing me across the road. And you would drive by entire towns submerged in this swirling sand. At one point, I broke out of the sandstorm and the rain, and I came across sort of a plateau that was lit by the moon, and it looked incredibly serene. There's the stars above, and the ground was just glowing silver with moonlight. And I thought, okay, I made it. But then I looked to my right. I saw something that looked like somebody had pulled a curtain from the earth all the way up to the sky. And it was a sandstorm, and it was moving towards me, slowly but surely. And I looked up, and it was blotting out the moon now. And I saw that it was coming closer. And then I looked down, and I saw a little orange light out of gas. At this point, I was very far from a gas station, and also had about $10 in cash on hand. And I started to run through what my options were. Almost immediately, I thought I should probably consider selling my body to a gas station attendant, because it's really the only currency that I have right now. And trying to imagine how I was going to go about it. And then I looked to my right again, and the sandstorm was closer. And I had the thought, I'll figure this out once I get out of the sandstorm. That sentence sort of stuck with me for a long time. It felt important somehow. Just in the nick of time, before the sandstorm hit me, I dropped into a valley. Because the zephyr is primarily elevation-based, you can dodge it by dropping an elevation. So, in the nick of time, I got out. But now that I was out of the sandstorm, I had another problem to face. I came across a gas station, finally, and took a deep breath and imagined what I would say to this gas station attendant. I kind of thought, best way to do it is just go in and try. So I just steeled myself, got up and walked inside, and I saw the man at the counter and then another man mopping in the back. And I thought, dang, 2 people, that's too much. So I immediately sidestepped into the bathroom to try and think. And I was thinking, maybe I write a note or something. What do I do? How do I get around this? And as I was sitting there thinking, my feet were just getting colder and colder, literally and figuratively. And I started to laugh because I couldn't believe that this was a chapter in a story that began with me taking lessons in violin at the age of 4. That my mom signed me up for violin lessons, and I practiced with a fruit roll-ups box because they wouldn't give me a violin because I was too young. And this moment in this bathroom is a part of that same story. So I went back out into the car and I dug around and I found quite a bit of quarters. With the $10 in cash that I had, I ended up making it to about $17, and I was able to get to Las Vegas. I ended up making it to Las Vegas, but Las Vegas isn't where I needed to go. Las Vegas is never where I need to go. I ended up driving around the city looking for a pawn shop that would buy my expensive microphone for more than 10% of what I'd paid for it, just so that I could keep moving along the road. And just as I was waiting for a call back from one of the better offers, some money I'd been waiting on came through. And again, it left me with this mystery of how is it that this feeling that I call the itch brings me to these dangerous storms and spits me out on the other side. I call my music Howls Road. Howls Road is a real place in the Feather River Canyon, but I don't spell it the way that it's spelled. It's named after a man named Howls who built roads and bridges through the Feather River Canyon. But the way I spell it isn't like his name. I spell it the way you would spell a wolf, howls, because I like to think of it as the name that the road had before that man named it after himself. Howls, hoots, chirps, the river that murmurs. Those are all things that can be said to be the name of that place. Before that man came, and long after everyone who remembered that man are gone. So on this tour, I had the chance to go to Howls Road, and I figured I should go because this is my first tour. But I knew that something terrible had happened there. I left and I drove through desert and farmland, eventually climbing into Pine Mountain Forest. And when I entered the Feather River Canyon, what once had been lush forests was now rows of blackened matchsticks. A couple years ago, a wildfire called the Campfire roared through this place. A lot of people died, and a lot of houses were destroyed. Habitats were ruined. And this entire place that I remembered from my childhood was totally changed. I used to come to Howls Road when I was a little kid. It was a place that meant adventure and exploration and imagination. But there was something very dark and unsettling about the place as well. The train that howls through the canyon makes an otherworldly noise It sounds like it fills your entire body. It feels like it's about to turn you inside out. You can't focus on anything else when the train is coming through. So I drove along Howls Road. It becomes a dirt road at a certain point, and I came across the cabin that we used to stay in. It was now just a pile of rubble, and I parked the car and I contemplated this. The sun was setting, and in its place rose a waxing crescent moon. I filled a cauldron up with some uva ursi, and I lit some charcoal to set it on fire. As I watched the fire, I contemplated the burning of the Feather River Canyon. I took water from the Feather River to extinguish the flame. Then I tilted the cauldron until the reflection of the waxing crescent moon aligned with the lip of the cauldron. I let the water reflect the silver light of the moon for a while. And the silver crescent reminded me of a white feather. I held this image, and it felt safe, protective. And then I stood and processed around my van 3 times, sprinkling the water as I went. I got the feeling as I did this that whatever had knocked on my window at Lake Tahoe was going to visit me again tonight. So I felt the need to do a warding ceremony. I got in the van to go to sleep, and the roaring sound of the train reverberated through the canyon like a violin bow being pulled across the string. The light of the train danced through the trees. And I fell into a deep sleep. When I woke up to the sound of the murmuring Feather River, I realized that I'd never walked all the way down Howls Road. And as I walked along, every single cabin that had once been there was a pile of rubble, and no one was living on Howls Road anymore. There were remnants of what those people's lives had been. Refrigerators, trampolines. There's the entire skeleton of a car that was now just a home for cobwebs and spiders. I made it to the end of Howls Road at last. And all around me were white feathers. I picked up some of the feathers, some of the blackened bark from the trees. I walked all the way back and drove away. I think I finally understand what this thing is that I call the itch. I was going through a book on the Chinese zodiac at my friend's house, and I opened the page to the horse, which is the year I was born, and it said that horses have an itch on their hooves that can only be scratched by movement. So this urge that you have to move around is actually scratching an itch that can only be fulfilled by movement. And I thought, that must be it. That's why it feels like an itch. But I thought it goes a little bit beyond that, because not only do you need to scratch this itch, but what you need to scratch it is space. You need the room to roam and scratch this itch. Otherwise, you're going to be left still and stagnant in this state of anxiety because you can't fulfill this urge. The way that you claim the space that you need is by running and moving through the world. And I'm reminded of this moment where I was driving through the desert, and this area that was supposed to become the Tesla Gigafactory was in this desert. And they built these restaurants for people who were supposed to be working on the structure. One of the buildings they built was a juice bar. The image of this juice bar in the middle of a desert was incredibly surreal. Like all the signifiers that you associate with gentrification in a larger city had just teleported out into the middle of this desert. And all around this juice bar were feral horses. And these horses were looking at this building like, what the hell is this? What am I looking at? And I think on some level they understood what this meant, because, like I said, they're feral horses, and that's different from wild horses, because feral horses come from a background of captivity. And so feral horses are, on some level, familiar with human civilization and structures. So I think on some level, these horses were looking at this juice bar and thinking, this space is no longer for us. I'm transgender, and in 2023, I think we have a lot in common with feral horses. Huge parts of the country seem to be fencing themselves off and declaring that the space that incorporates their state isn't welcome to trans people. And it seems to be a debate whether or not we're allowed to occupy certain spaces. And even in spaces that are supposed to be for us, like queer bars, we have to fear the threat of violence. The Club Q shooting in Colorado Springs happened while I was out on tour. And I had just driven through Colorado Springs and played not far from there. So it affected me. It affects all of us to understand that if we're out in a place that is supposed to be for us, we have to be afraid of the threat of violence. And that's why the itch always seemed to lead me into these dangerous places. It led me through hurricanes and windstorms and snow and rain. And it led me through a different storm, which is 2023 America with regards to transgender people. There's a storm, there's an argument that seems to be happening the same way that there was an argument between the mountain and the desert in the form of the washoe zephyr. I'm trapped in this argument that seems to be debating whether or not I should be allowed to take up space. So the itch seems to be sort of a reckless urge, and I understand why it seems that way. But really, there is no existence as a queer person without a degree of recklessness. My forebears that walked the streets in places that they knew they would face violence did so because they had no other option. But by moving through these spaces, they made them a space where a transgender person could exist. And so by moving through the world, you actually assert that this is a space where you can exist. So while people have told me who care about my well-being that transitioning and traveling is going to be a very dangerous lifestyle, I appreciate the concern. But if you have concern for the safety of trans people, the solution is to help make the world more safe for transgender people. Speak up and raise your voice. Vote, support activists, correct people when they spread misinformation, and do everything you can to support trans creators and activists who are out doing this work. This is the final mystery of the itch. Why did I keep getting close to danger, but ultimately leaving unscathed? And the answer to that is that I find support where I look for it. Support is readily available, more than I expect. The only reason I was able to travel like this and perform my music was due to the support of a community. People who shared their house, their bed, their shower, their food, their conversation, their music, their money, all kept me moving. And if you're one of those people, thank you. And if you're just listening to this, thank you. Because if you've listened this far, that means that you've given me the space to tell this story, which has been on my mind for a long time. So thank you. And I hope to see you down the road.
The Wind is produced by me, Fil Corbitt. This episode was written, read, and scored by Emily Pratt. And when I say scored, I mean every guitar you hear, every violin, keyboard, every cello, that is all Emily. She is a longtime Wind contributor, creative partner, and friend. And if you'd like to find her music, which I highly recommend, head to howlsroad.bandcamp.com. I will also post the newest Howls Road EP and her Patreon on the website. This season was made with support from the Google Podcast Creator Program through PRX and by listeners like you. If you'd like to help keep this thing going, head to patreon.com/thewind and set up a monthly donation. At $7 a month, you get access to the exclusive, official Wind Listener patch. For photos, links, merch, and more, head to thewind.org. Thank you for being here, and keep listening.